Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're at the bottom of page 1229. The pages, if you want to follow, can be found at ayinbeis.com. So we've now moved up a level in Moichin itself, the cognitive process of using the intellect, which is obviously the most superior faculty of a human being. Because the intellect, as I explained yesterday, expresses objective search of the mind and able to experience something outside of your own subjective interests. So the midas constitute the core of a human being. If you recall, he said the main thing of a human being is midas, because that's experience. The mind, in a way, is almost like a gift that allows us to go beyond our experience, to imagine things we haven't experienced, to be able to connect to things that we have not yet felt. And in so many ways, that mind allows us the bridge to connect to the Ein Sof, ultimately to that which is beyond the very structure of our consciousness. So, in the growth and development of a human being from mutfa, a very natural, biological, reflexive personality, and then the characteristics, the emotional characteristics, beginning to emerge, to murgash. In murgash itself, we spoke about many levels. We didn't speak all the levels, but several levels in murgash itself as the child grows. From pure natural feelings to guided feelings, to feelings that are awakened and stimulated by the mind, and even to the level of a moich where you're able to conceive of something, and that alone awakens an emotion. As he said, it's still called Chassidus HaMoichin, for the reasons we discussed yesterday. Firstly, it still relates to you in some way. In the context of the divine soul, this process also the natural love of a divine soul to the divine, to the source. So it's behavioral, just following what God asks of a human soul to do, of a soul that comes into the human being to accomplish. Then there's a little more emotion. And as the intellect grows, so does the avodas Hashem of a person grow, the work. That's not just based on our natural love, because the neshama in heaven also has natural love. The goal was that the neshama comes down, the soul comes down to this world to achieve something, not just to express its natural love for the divine, but to achieve something. And that's where the mind comes in and the emotions develop further. But then there's Chassidus HaMoichin, when we're talking in murgish itself, how muskal, what he called the murgish mitzad HaSeichel, how the mind affects the emotions, but there's still a stage that was we learned yesterday, at the end of the last paragraph, where it's called Chassidus HaMoichin, or he calls HaMoichin HaShayochim El HaMidas, where you're contemplating on the divine, even though it's not the divine as it is in your interest, your life, your sustenance, your father, but it's still the divine as it relates to the context of existence, from existence that you're discovering godliness that's beyond existence. They called it also Chassidus HaMoichin because it comes b'levushei hasaga. In other words, the focus is on understanding something. She'ein meir b'zeh etzem ha'er eliki. You don't see and radiate in it the etzem ha'er, the very divine energy, or the truth of that divine energy. And in general, it's a moichin is in order to be me'er in midas. And what dominates is still the emotions that are awake, that are stimulated by this contemplation. The contemplation gets more concealed as the emotions, the love and awe of God dominate. And that's why this is all called the level of murgish levad and bechinas midas like shemitzad haseichel amelida. So it's really midas, emotions, but it's the mind that gives birth to them. Okay. In other words, not just the mind that stimulates the natural love, it also gives birth to a love that's deeper and more passionate because it's about the godliness that you see through existence, beyond existence. All of existence is nullified in front of it in its presence. In the new paragraph at the bottom of page 1229, the Rebbe Rashab now introduces Pnimiyus HaMeichen. Now, Pnimiyus HaMeichen, he says, is the contemplation, not how godliness is seen through the context and the lens of existence, but he calls it is removed from the worlds, both the lower worlds, biyah, and the higher worlds, ilm is biyah, haklolim, if that's how we understand it. So it's completely about the mind as it's removed from all existence, not in relation to existence. And it's also a contemplation on the haflah, the reimus of Ein Sof. So you could have a contemplation of the fact that God is removed, but then you focus on the haflah of it. What kind of reality is it? It's completely not defined in any way by what we consider to be existence. And then he finally says, and also haflah. So this is a diuk. Here he doesn't elaborate, but earlier in Ayin Beis, as I mentioned yesterday, there's there's bonus in the haflah, in the wonder, and eifan haflah, and the manner that God is so beyond. So you can be mispol, and you can contemplate on the very fact that God is completely different than anything, but you can also the eifan haflah, how he's different. And the same thing in the parentheses he adds, in contrast to the earlier stage, what's called Chassidus HaMeichen, where you're contemplating our godliness as it is in Seder Shtalshlus. Here, the Asog is in Yonim Nailim de Ein Sof, in high levels of Ein Sof, like Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. Pre-Tzimtzum, Ein Sof is removed from existence. So all this goes into these bonus, what he calls Pnimiyus HaMeichen, the inner dimension of intellect, as I explained yesterday, what that means. So it's a deeper dimension. It's not about purely moichen as in understanding things, but it's how the mind can grasp entities and dimensions that are beyond structure as we know it. I mean, just as an example, the difference between, let's say, practical physics and theoretical physics. That when you get into the theoretical, you're dealing with imagining and theorizing about ideas, about things that are not necessarily provable and definitely not observable. So relatively speaking, they're both intellectual processes, but one is working with things that are empirically capable of being evaluated or proven or tested, whereas in theoretical levels, you're dealing with abstractions that perhaps can be proven at some point, but a lot of it is speculation and instinct. But the mind is going into places that is trying to imagine realities that we cannot directly perceive, whether it's string theory or quantum mechanics, just as an example of how the mind can go to places that is beyond the structural that we are usually accustomed to. Okay. Just as an example, obviously this is far higher levels. So now, in the last line on page 1229, he goes, Gam, additionally, next page, 1230, the level of Pnimiyus, the inner cognitive process, or the inner intellect, who hasaga b'chinas hafshata, okay, I see he's contrasting it to what we learned before. So the first thing he established is what levels Pnimiyus HaMeichen focuses on. Chassidus HaMeichen focuses on the divine as we see it through existence. Like he said, the four different types. Whether we look at the fact that that all of creation is only a reflection of the divine. And the divine is not, the source is not affected by it. I'm just looking. Or the second thing was the nifla ma'id, the very process of creation is so wondrous. Or a specific contemplation. This third thing is what I wanted to focus on, where we focus on Eris and Kalim. I'm reading at the bottom of page 1228. Or the specific worlds. And the fourth thing he brought about the ribui, the multitude of ishtalshus from the highest to the lowest levels. So especially point number 3, like we just discussed, is with the levels that the Chassidus Hameichen is focusing on, is the divine, not as it is relates to our subjective needs, as in our sustenance, chayenu and avinu and so on, but it's still the divine as we see it through existence. The contrast in Primus Hameichen, if you were to make 2 columns, in Primus Hameichen the focus is on Ein Sof itself, Atzmus Ein Sof, that's completely removed from existence. And the hafla of it and the eifan hafla. And as far as so what you're contemplating on is not that the worlds are all a reflection of divine, of godliness, only a reflection. Or the hafla, the wonder of creation itself. In Primus Hameichen, it's about Eirens, it's about the levels that are beyond existence. And as far as the level goes, in contrast to the 10, to Eris and Kalim and 10 spheres, and the levels, that specific levels of Atzilus, now we're talking about an example, Eirens of the finite Simpson. But there was also a different distinction. We also said before that the Chassidus Hameichen goes into Levushei Hasoge, that the focus is on the garments of understanding something. That when you're sitting and understanding, the focus is on the comprehension of all the intricacies of the cognitive process. Whereas now, Primus Hameichen, he says, Hasoge b'chinas hafshata shelo yidevei levushei hasoge. It's a comprehension through abstraction. That's not through the garments of understanding. Levushei hasoge shemeir b'zeh. Okay, levushei hasoge. So contrast that to the line in the previous paragraph. He says, "Gam chassidus mechu shababa levushei hasoge she'eina meir b'zeh etzem eliki." And now he says, "Hafshata shelo yidei levushei hasoge shemeir b'zeh etzem eliki." So there you have. He's literally comparing to everything he said before about outer cognitive process, which is Chassidus Hameichen. So first he spoke about that it's about the godliness that's completely removed and not through existence. He spoke about the very level. We're not talking about the levels in the shtalshus, but the levels beyond, like before the tzimtzum. In Chassidus Hameichen, it's levushei hasoge. So the focus is on understanding, not so much on the resonating truth of the very core divine experience or divine entity. But whereas in Primus Hameichen, it's hafshata, which means you're abstracting, like I said before, with theoretical physics as an example, that it's not coming through a direct understanding, and therefore in this Primus Hameichen radiates the etzem eliki. So let me explain a little what that means. Even though I think I explained it yesterday a bit, but I want to go a step further even. Whenever you understand any idea, there's 2 things really happening. There's one is comprehending in as much detail as possible the picture, the story that is being conveyed, whatever it may be. Let's say you're talking about Atzilus. And Atzilus, we know, has energies and containers. But there, the energies and containers are all aligned to godliness. So there's a whole concept. You can sit, as we've learned in Maimorim, as we're learning all the time, it's a concept. And we're using our levushei hasoge, the same levushei hasoge that we would use in understanding a scientific idea, or something in economics, or something in any science, or any school of thought. You're using that to understand godliness. So the focus there is on understanding well what the subject is. But in that process, even if you understand it accurately, there's another part of it, which is, what is the result of it all? The result is that you get a sense, a deep resonating sense of whatever it is that you're studying. And that's a whole different story. That's more than just the hasaga itself. Like, for example, a brilliant mind can memorize theorems and postulates and all kinds of scientific laws, but they may be lacking so-called the spirit of it all. So you can understand something and just still be missing the underlying spirit. When you see someone speak about that idea that's a real master, they can say the same words, but you can sense that they sense a deeper truth that comes out of these ideas. And the same thing even when you're studying Gemara. You can have one person who's understanding the Gemara very well, then someone who really gets it comes and studies the same thing, and you see that they come away with a punchline and even the spirit of it that is not quite just defined by the pure logic of it. So the logic is the mechanics. We're not talking about someone who's off and wrong. If they're wrong, then we're not talking about comprehending the idea correctly. But there's understanding, and then there's understanding. In a way, even though he doesn't use this, if you remember, we spoke about chachma, bina, and then das, a resonance, a type of sense of the truth of it, a samtus, a personalization. It's not really das here. It's just an example that in seichel, there's levels of how you comprehend. So you can understand something. So when it comes to things that are closer to us, that are more observable. Let's go back to what he spoke before. Someone, sumarim enechem, you look at existence and you say, nothing can create itself. You see the wonder of nature, the synchronicity of billions and billions of different details, trillions, and they all work together in a harmony. And you realize, one second, if a simple painting or a book or a composition of music testifies to a composer or an author or an artist, how much more so when you see such beauty in the world around us, even in your own very body, a healthy body, how everything works together. It's a miracle. In the birth of a child, who can deny the miracle? So you see from that, your mind is understanding something that you don't see every day. We may take it for granted if we don't think about it. But when you do think about it, it's quite awesome. So that brings you to, like we learned before, a love that you want to connect to this source of it all. But this does not require completely. Somewhat, yes, God, the creator is beyond us, but it doesn't require, you do have enough to hold on to. You can point at something and say, look how beautiful this harmony is. That's visible to the eye and empirically observable, and we can hear it and we can taste, touch, or smell it. Our senses, our sensory experiences experience it. And that brings you to realize that there's a creator that you don't see, but behind the scenes, there has to be something that's driving all of this. When you're talking now the levels that we're speaking, let's say Lifnei Tzimtzum, or the very core essence of what God is, not through his art, not through his literature, through his book, or through his architecture, or through his music. You're thinking about God himself right now in the words that he said, that he's muvdal ma'elamus. And the hafla and reimamus of this, here, a human being like us, I'm talking now, I'm not getting now into high level, the souls that have different levels of experience, but all of us who are people of our sensory tools that we use to experience things, here you cannot just rely on what you see, because you're not looking at God through the eyes of creation. You're looking at God through your imagination almost, or through learning about it in Chassidus, or Ata Harei Ladas. God has revealed something about himself to us. We would never have figured out there's Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. We could have speculated that God is beyond everything. But when you start talking about it, you realize these are levels that we would not come to with our own direct observation. So you have to use hafshata here. You can't use the vusha asog in the sense, okay, here's something I can understand. Here I can dissect it. I can observe it. I could even extrapolate and come to realize that the creator is beyond it. But there's something to work with. You have art, and you're coming to realize it has an artist, and then you come to realize the artist is not defined by being an artist. Okay, but then what is he defined by? Or how do you define his non-definition? This requires a different level of moichin. That's not just the mind as it's understanding things, but it's the mind as it's able to so-called, I don't use imagine is the right word, even though I don't like to use the word because he doesn't use it here. He doesn't say koyach hadimyan or koyach hamedam or anything like that. I'm just using it to explain the idea. But the mind has the ability to abstract and relate to etzem ha'inyan aliki, which is not godliness. It's not godliness as defined by any product of his, but it's the etzem ha'inyan aliki about godliness. And sometimes seichel itself is not enough. Sometimes you need a niggin, a song. And sometimes you need an experience. Like even when I mentioned before the miracle of birth. So it's true, it's observable. You see a child and it's like wondrous. It's awesome, overwhelmingly awesome if you think about it. Creation of a life from where? Where did it come from? And the whole life that's going to come ahead and all that comes with life. So even there's also etzem eliki in it, which is not defined by the actual fact that you see the birth of a child, a healthy child, everything is working, but there's almost like a sense of something that is beyond. But there, it's still ultimately still through you're still experiencing the divine through something. Whereas here, you're talking about trying to relate to and use the primus hamoichin, not through levusha asaga, not through comprehension, but understanding the etzem ha'inyan aliki, which is far beyond just the sum of the parts that makes sense in logic. Now, this is not faith. He's not calling this amuna. He's calling it moichin, primus hamoichin. So it's the mind at work, but it's the mind not as focused on mechanics and details, but the mind as it's experiencing or relating to something that is beyond structure. Hafshata, it means abstract, but it also means theoretical. It means where you don't have the specifics to hold on to. Okay.
Yeah, you use the word understand. I mean, in English, I don't know.
He uses hasaga b'bchinas hafshata. He's using understanding, but in the state not hafshata means like by stripping something. There are things you understand by giving examples, by relating to it, by putting it into some context that we can so-called hold on to, handles. Hafshata is the opposite, is when you strip it from all its outer expressions. You're getting to the core of the idea. I'll just give an example that the Rabbi uses, not on this. There's a din in halacha, in the Gemara, in halacha, moide b'miktzas chayiv shvua. If one person, Ruvain, says that Shimon owes him $1,000, and Shimon says, no, I owe you $500. So what do you do? Who do you believe? So the Gemara, the din is, Shimon has to take an oath. Now, why don't you go to a din Torah? Why take an oath? Because, and the Gemara gives a reason. Because ein odem meiz pona b'fnei bal cheve. If Shimon would have said, I owe you nothing, so then you have yourself a real problem. But since he's admitting, so we rely on a rule that in human nature, ein odem meiz pona b'fnei bal cheve. A person doesn't have the chutzpah in the presence of someone he's indebted to basically ignore him, so to speak. So if he's saying 500, we give him the benefit of the doubt, but just to make sure, he has to take an oath. But so you have there a seichel. The seichel is meide b'miktzas chayiv shvua. It's a rule. That's the application. The seichel behind it, which is more like Ur HaSeichel. The Rebbe explains it in a letter. In other words, what's the underlying reason behind it is because a human being is not going to lie in front of someone he's indebted to. But then comes something deeper. Why won't he lie? People lie all the time. So the Rebbe uses the word because of the edelkeit of the neshama. A human being has a certain refined state. And refinement of a human being, obviously people could be corrupted and not follow it, but on their natural level, there's a edelkeit in the neshama, a refinement, a certain, that doesn't allow a person to be not a mensch. Now, the Welt says, what do you mean? We see people all the time that are spitting in the face of people they owe things to, that are indebted to. So the Welt says, the Taiches, the Gemara says, Ein Adam meis panav b'fnei bal cheve. If he's an Adam, if he's not a mensch, he's not an Adam, then he'll do things that are not worthy of a human being. So, but that's an aside. The point I want to make here is that the same thought, this rule, that you're someone who basically acknowledges a partial debt is defined by the fact of how human nature works, and human nature goes back to the core of the essence of the edelkeit. Now, when you talk to people, very often people tell you about a problem they have. It's usually the symptoms they're telling you about. I'm not getting along with my spouse or with my children, or I have my own, it's the symptoms. They're describing what they're experiencing, which is fine. But a trained eye is going to look for the underlying causes. And the underlying causes are not usually obvious. They're not just to the naked eye. Even the person who's involved may not even be aware, because we are blinded and we see what we see. What am I pointing out? We're trying to point out that in Chassidus HaMeichin, you understand things based on your tools. And in Primus HaMeichin, you're able to see deeper into the so-called underlying truth of what drives things that are not so, and it's a level that's not so obvious. So it is called hasaga, but you're not focusing on levush hasaga, the hasaga as it manifests in a specific way, let's say a mathematical formula, but you're going into what lies behind it. What is the deeper truth behind the scenes? Comes to godliness, the etzem min elaki, in contrast to the structured understanding of the godliness within that subject. So I could give it more examples, but you know what? Let me suffice with what I've said. Want more examples? There's ways to go about this. It's I'll give one more example. In the world of Hasaga and Chassidus HaMeichin, we talk about Chesed and Gvura. Chesed is giving, Gvura is withholding. Chesed is kindness, love. Gvura is restraint, discipline. All the things that we know about Chesed and Gvura. In Atzilus, these are two divine attributes. When God is, let's say, the flow of God's energy is flowing, it's Chesed. When God is restraining or withholding or concealing, it's Gvura, or channeling or directing and guiding. Okay, that's can be understood in a deep and profound way. It's called Levushe Hasaga. We understand it, we analyze it. What's the difference between the two? How much they need each other? All good. But if you go Lifnei Tzimtzum, and I'm specifically using that term because he used it in the previous page, and you're going to levels that are not yet defined, and even in Chesed and Gvura, you say to yourself, where are these two rooted in so-called divine consciousness or in divine, not as the divine is defined as an attribute of giving or withholding, of Ava and Yira, for example, love and awe. We're not talking about as is defined in a structural, logical way. But how is it rooted? So all the way in the highest levels, it'll say these are two kavim, two tracks. The power of God to shine, to give off light, and the power of God not to shine and not to give off light. Now, when you talk on that level, you're not discussing things in terms of what chesed looks like, what gvura looks like. You're talking about two divine strengths. the divine that chooses to give and the divine that chooses not to. And there you can't talk in terms of what is chesed like, what is gvura like, because it's two divine tracks, equally godly, equally purely divine forces. When you go into the yechelis of atzmos, when you say yechel, that God has the capacity, the potential, yecholte lahayer, yecholte shaloi lahayer. So now you're talking about in the divine, from chesed and gvura, we've come to understand that there has to be rooted somewhere that there are two tracks where God chose two types of methods of expression. One that we'll call it expression to himself, and one is expression to another. That will ultimately, after the tzimtzum, evolve to what we call chesed and gvura. So when we look at it down from earth, from the bottom up, we see structures. We slowly come to understand from the structures, one second, these are divine energies. So you see fire and water, that's very tangible. You then come to realize, one second, that's gvura and chesed, of yitzir, of asiyah. Then you move to the level of yitzira. It's more abstract. And then to bria, and then to atzilus. And as you climb, what you're doing is you're coming to ultimately understand that there's something the way it is in godliness that doesn't relate to existence at all. It's just two godly forces. The only reason I hesitate with saying that this mashal is a perfect mashal is because at the end of the day, it is coming through contemplating chesed and gvura, which is the structure of existence. And here he wants to talk about, as he said, the etzem inya leki. That's kodesh shemuvdom elamas. But it still works because you see here how the same thing which relates to us in existence, when you start thinking of it on the divine level, it's nothing to do with existence. It's simply two divine forces. Yes, it will ultimately, after the tzimtzum and so on, turn into a structure, but that would be a little more of another example of understanding something that's not levusha asaga, and therefore meir b'zeh etzem inya leki. And primis hamoichin. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Because now he's going to go to the next point. Remember, there were 3 points. The point of what we're contemplating on, Chassidus Samechin contemplates the divine that relates to existence. Primis Samechin, divine beyond existence. In the Chassidus Samechin, it's through levusha asagas, through basically the garments and tools of comprehension. And primis samechin is the etzem inya leki, the divine essential truth. And the third thing he said, the moichin shayach lemidus, and moichin that's not shayach lemidus. That's what he's going to talk about now, the third point. So, but I wanted to just stop since it's a little dense. If anybody wants any clarification or want to ask anything.
I have a question, Rabbi. So yesterday you were going into this a little bit at the end of the class, and I think you were saying that, well, among other things, that the pnimius hamochin is a mental contemplation of God that as God does not relate to us. It's not. He's not the manifestation of godliness in the world's post tzimtzum, but rather pre tzimtzum, and that which we therefore cannot relate to because it pre-exists the reality of the world. And you also said that the difference. I think you said the difference between pnimius hamochin, this higher level, this abstraction contemplation, versus chitzonius hamochin. You said that chitzonius, the hasaga in chitzonius hamochin is how we contemplate it, how we understand it, using our brain, bringing it within us as we can relate to it. But the pnimius hamochin is essentially us experiencing godliness without us putting it in our own terms. Almost, I think you were saying, like it was coming to us rather than us sort of defining it ourselves. It's almost like an experience rather than a thought process, is how I heard you say it yesterday. My question is, well, I guess I've got two questions. One is, and the two questions are opposed to each other, and they're a little bit of
What is the question?
okay. Well, they're just, I'm saying they're against each other. One is, lahavdil, let's say an atheist comes about our way and says, oh, so you're telling me about godliness, but you can't, you're saying that by definition, it doesn't relate to anything in this world. So how do I know you're making it up? How do I know you're not making it up? Because you're telling me that it doesn't relate to anything in this world, it's something beyond this world. And how do I know this isn't just in your mind? Number one. Number two, if you say, well, because it really exists, and I'm not making it up. I'm telling you that by means of certain contemplations and behavior, when I said Torah mitzvahs, masim tovim, and contemplation, etc., that I can tell you that this is real. This is not imaginary. Then,
so what's the question?
Atheist.
I still don't understand. You're asking me what the answer to the atheist is?
Yes, but wait, the contradiction.
Okay, so let me respond.
Okay, but there's two questions. The second question is, if it's something that's not made up that I'm experiencing, then how do you say it doesn't relate to this world? I'm relating to it. I'm experiencing it. So there's a word for that. Something that. Sorry, those are the two questions.
The answer is very straightforward. It's not really relevant to this mimer. It's relevant to all of Chassidus. Whenever we talk about God as beyond existence, I'll just be very brief because I don't want to, sidetrack here. The answer is two things. Based on the fact that you accept that the Torah is true, and the Torah tells us these things, that's number one. That God has revealed himself and shared with us things about him that we may not have come to on our own. That's one. Number two, through extrapolation. It's like coming to say, like when people say, okay, nothing can create itself. That's why we need God. So then, of course, every atheist asks, so then who created God? Same logic. And the answer is that the mere fact that God's a creator and everything else was created, comes to tell you that creator is very different than we are. So through a process of extrapolation, like saying that we know the artist can't just be defined by being an artist, you come to realize there are dimensions in the divine that are not defined by the thing he created. Like Avram Avinu coming through a process of elimination, realizing that he's searching for the creator. Is the other way around. If the creator is the creator has dimensions that we will never fully understand and relate to. If the creator would be something that we can fully understand, then he's not a creator, then he's one of us. So there's both elements here. You can come to it through a process of elimination. You finally come to points like that. Besides the first point that I made, revelation, that there's revelation. And ultimately, yes, he is talking about that we experience something that's about God that's completely beyond us. That's the whole point. This is relating to God as he relates to us on a subjective level. That's like the first level, that God is our Father, our sustenance. And secondly, God, as he is beyond existence, but still creates existence. And through existence, you come to realize the wonder of God. And then finally, that leads you to understand that God must be beyond that as well. That's the brief answer. Another just short point. If a person's an atheist, they have a problem even with the first step. No atheist will say, oh yes, I accept God as a creator of existence, as an artist, but not beyond. They will challenge that too. Every evolutionary biologist, the prevalent view is that the world was not created by a creator. The world basically evolved by many, many accidents and tests and trial and error, and ultimately we have the life we have here. So if you want atheist is going to challenge even the lower levels as well. That's my final point. So there's always a certain axiom that you have to go with, but the axiom also has logic to it. Those are my responses.
Thank you.
Okay. Now he says the following: the bihizbonus kazeis, the second line on page 1230. This type of contemplation, ha'ikuru b'chinas hamoichin. So now he's coming to the third point. Remember, we said the points were that you're through existence, you come to the divine. Now we're talking about the divine as is completely beyond existence. Etzamin alaki. The second, levushas, the beyond existence, meaning Kodesh and Muvdal, and like Aaron said before, the Tzimtzum. The second thing is that Chetzenius HaMeichen is Levushya HaSaga, the garments of understanding something that you could hold on to, handles. And how we're talking about Etzem Eliki, Hafshata. Levush means to dress, Hafshata means to undress, to strip. So one is through putting into garments that you understand. One is abstracting it from those garments and moving beyond. Etzem Eliki. And now he says the third thing, that this is bonus. In contrast, Chetzenius HaMeichen, the ikar there is Moichin HaShayach Lemidus. Because the whole point is in order to awaken emotions that the human being should feel the divine. Here is bonus Chetzenius HaIkar B'chinas HaMeichen. V'abmidas boim b'derech memela. Here the focus is mainly on the Moichin, the mind, being able to abstract and travel to places that are completely beyond you. Not as it relates to you, to places that are completely beyond you, where you are essentially actually suspending yourself. In the Chetzenius HaMeichen, he made it clear, it's all about the emotions, but the emotions are being born through contemplation. And as we discussed from Kunter Saveda, what we read yesterday as well, that's B'shvil Eres HaMidas. And that's why the Midas are so dominant at the end of the last paragraph on the last page. Here, the focus is on the experience of something beyond you. And Mamela, the Midas come Mamela, not as the dominant driving force. But there, the Moichin is in order to relate to and get your emotions stimulated to love God through contemplating on godliness that we can relate to. Here, it's about being absorbed in a higher state of being, and then the midas come automatically, and the way it's in the mind, in other words, you're now completely bonded with and so-called absorbed in this higher experience. Keinu meir b'leiv mamish. That's also how it will radiate in your emotions. So instead of your emotions and your subjective emotions, not just subjectivity like in level number 1 in mutfa, but even in murgish, where the mid is still, it's you feeling something, love or awe. But here, the lev is now being lifted, and the mind's energy, this mind experience, this primis hameichen, is radiating in the lev mamish, v'amidas hein sichlim mamish. The midas have now moved from an emotional midas tivim, to midas sichlim, she'ena murgoshim klal, that they're not even in a state of being feeling something. Because when you're absorbed in a reality that's greater than you are, you as an individual and your midas and your subjectivity is now absorbed also in something greater. It's still affecting you, but it's not affecting you on your terms, that I'm liking it, I'm attracted to it, I'm drawn to it, but it's affecting you because you're all absorbed into a higher reality, and your emotions are also absorbed into that state. So I've given the example in the past. Of two types of people standing in front of, let's say, an awesome natural wonder. So one person is like a journalist. They're watching it and they're documenting it and they're writing it down. Here are my reactions. Here's how people are reacting to it. So as much as it's awesome, you're still as a subject and an object. There's a duality going on. It's you looking at the experience. And then there's a person that's so absorbed and mesmerized by the moment, they are not even feeling themselves. It's like when you're listening to a song and you lose sense of yourself even. You're completely so immersed in it that you're not even conscious that you're immersed. Person reading a book, and so absorbed they're turning the pages, and they could be crying and laughing and suspenseful. You don't even realize you're reading a book because the writer has so captured the moment, so captured the scene that you are now part of it. And then somebody suddenly shakes you on your shoulder, and you suddenly realize I'm reading a book. It's like being ultimately in the zone. You're so immersed that the subject has melted into the object. So it doesn't mean your emotions disappeared. It means, however, you're not feeling you. I'm not saying I like it. You're so part of it, like it's all like a fish in water, where you can't even say, I'm getting wet. You are wetness itself. It's the ultimate mola oretz deus Hashem, kamayim layam echas, we talk about in the future, where the day is so unites with us that there's no difference between the you and what you know and your experience. So what's happened here is you've gotten to a level where the person is being lifted through this primis hameichin. The ikar is the meichin, the midas come automatically, and the weights in the meir belev mamash midas and sichel mamash she'enu murgashim klal. Now I know you could say, one second, he says there's sichlim. He doesn't say you just becomes one with you. But in this case, what I mean by sichlim, my explanation is, but sichlim means it's not about you feeling it and appreciating it even. Your emotions have all become part of the mind's experience of this higher state of reality, of the elikuz that's beyond existence. And now it qualifies. Even though, on the other hand of things, this level of meichin causes a lot more passion in the heart, that the heart is burning increasingly with fiery flames. With the flames of fire that are a lot of yearning and longing, it's not in a way that you feel it as you're experiencing it. In other words, your whole being is alive and aflame, but it's not you experiencing it, it's you are it. And that motion is in that level, not as a subjective experience, but as a one that is completely absorbs the person. Now, in Kuntus Aveda, he explains this more, so it'll be more understandable. I want to read it in Kuntus Aveda, the second page. I copied it. It's on the WhatsApp, but I want to first finish the paragraph, and then we'll go back to this. So now he refers us to look at other Maimorim that talk about this. Ayin Mashnis Barlel Dibra Maskal Nachmu Nachmu Ami. That's in volume 1. And Dibra Maskal Ve'el Shmeis V'Dibra Maskal Ve'era, and that's in volume 2. Ubekama Duchtin or Kama Drushim Kama Duchtin. Now the reason the Rebbe Rashab refers us to these places is because here he's being very brief, just telling us the level. He's not explaining it. In these Maimorim, there's more explanation on the topic. But let me first finish the paragraph, and then I'll explain. V'zehu ikar b'chinas hamuskal. Now this now is the primary level of muskal, not mudva, not murgash, not the natural, not the felt, murgash as you feel it. Shemeir gili erameichin b'midas b'chinas gili kamei shehem. It's still meichin affecting midas. Remember, they all three were a midas, but now it's the revelation of the meichin as they are on their own. It's not the meichin adjusting itself or relating to the midas, whatever level of midas. We're talking where the meichin is in its purest form, relating to these highest levels of the divine. And in this level, the midas, affected by this level of primis hameichin of the muskal, the midas are with intense and great divine energy and vitality. They're very internal, very intimate. That's the inner dimension of the heart. Like we said, pnimis hamoichin, pnimis halev, v'heim b'bchinas sichli mamish. And here, the emotions have become sichli mamish, like we spoke about tchila v'rechima sichlin, which is much higher than tchila v'rechima tivim. It's from Tanya. One is in Yitzira, one is in Bria. So this is now the level where the midas have been elevated to this pure inner cognitive experience of the divine that's beyond all of it, all of existence. Okay. Now, question is, can we find an example in our lives where you have a passion on this level? Because if you said there was no passion and no emotions altogether, in other words, a person is in a very just not conscious of what's going on, meaning they're so absorbed, like I said before, you're so absorbed, you're not conscious. But he's saying here that the heart is burning. There is a passion. So the way I would explain it would be, like I mentioned before, the example, let's say, with a natural wonder or with music. When a person is not feeling their own subjective emotions, like an outsider, I'm experiencing, I'm not experiencing, but they're completely absorbed, this doesn't mean they can't be completely passionate as well. Now, you can lose your whole so-called self in the experience and be very passionate, except it's not a passion where here you are and you feel passionate, but rather you have become like, passion is a state of being, not a verb, to put it in different words. That's very much, it sounds like what he's saying here. And in that sense, it's the diametric opposite of a subjective emotion, where there's I. Yes, I'm not focusing on myself, I'm focusing on godliness that gives me life, or deeper godliness that created it all, and everything is nullified before him, so I want to connect with his God. And then there's where the I is not relevant. Or so to speak, it's absorbed in the higher experience. So there's no longer subject and object in a sense. And it's the mind that is completely controlling, the inner mind that's completely controlling the experience. And the emotions are all part of that. That's on a very sensible level what he's saying right now. As I said, I'd like to read the Kuntus Aveda. I don't know if we have time today, but the Kuntus Aveda elaborates more on this. And also these Maimorim that he referred to would be worthwhile going there. But I'll do that in the next year because it's not going to be 2 minutes. But if you do want to look it up, on page 7, in Kuntus Aveda, he talks about, not page 7, I'm sorry, on page 9. Actually, I didn't scan those pages. I'll scan those pages as well. Because in Kuntus Aveda, there's more explanation on this whole topic. And I'm also going to look into these Maimorim, Nachamu, Shmeis, and Va'era, in volume 1 and volume 2. Okay. Final thing I want to say before we'll take any questions, he suddenly now introduces Pnimius Halev. Doesn't say much about it, just uses the term, because in Lev as well, just like in Moichin, Chitzenius Halev is when you feel the emotions. Pnimius Halev is when you're not feeling it, you just it. Like in this case, it's much deeper emotions. So on one hand, they're more intense, but they're less tangible. So just to give an example, and the Bechinas Sichlim Mamish. Yeah. And again, Sichlim should not be understood that they're intellectual emotions. That's not what he's saying. They're what I said yesterday about Sichlim Mamish. They're not about your subjective. It's about a deeper, higher truth. So one small example that I would use that maybe help with this, because this, whenever you do, well, here's a question. If someone asks you, share with me your most intimate feelings about something. You're going to find that most people can't read, or not most, everybody, you're not going to find many words to explain. It says. The heart of a person, the lips, the mouth cannot express fully. When it comes to superficial things like the weather, sports, politics, and other things that are very surface level, you can talk and talk and talk. All you got to do is turn on talk radio and you see what are they talking about most of the time. So here's the question. When it comes to the deepest, most innermost realities in your life, important things, you don't have many words. When it comes to superficial things, we have plenty of words. The answer is because words are kalim, and containers can only contain that much energy. So when the energy is not that intense, you can speak and speak and speak. When it comes to deeper feelings and deeper experiences, these containers are just not adequate. It's like trying to pour gallons of water in a little cup. So then you need other language. So we've created the language of metaphor, poetry, music, song, riddles, hints. Now the containers have become wider, so there's more that can be expressed. But in direct contrast to logic, the more you understand it, in a way, the more the limited er. That's why I remember as a kids, we hated poetry. You don't understand. Why can't the poet just write things clearly? Why do they have to be so cryptic? But then you come to realize, because you want to capture something that's broader, you need something that you can't just use regular containers. But then there's expressions like oy vey, or ah, sometimes just a cry, a laugh, that can capture more than all volumes, because even metaphor is not enough, because the intensity of the oyer is so much that the only container you have is just a cry, just a syllable. And then there's what the Zohar calls kol de lo yishtama, a voice that can't even be heard. You can't even cry because it's so intense. Even a sound is already too limited to express that intensity. So here's this interesting paradox. The more expressible it is, the more defined it is, the less energy. The more energy, the less definition. Why is this so important to know? Because it goes counterintuitive to everything we initially think. We think the things that are most real are the things we can relate to. Then you come to realize the things that are most real are the things that you don't have much expression in words altogether. When someone says to you, can you explain to me what love is? Or what truth is, or what the soul is, or what God is? You're going to find it much more difficult than if someone said to you, can you explain to me what a table and a chair and what a political campaign is? Well, I don't know, political campaign could also be quite... Because the deeper the truth, the more intimate it is, kalim are just simply not adequate. This is the example in Chassidus, that the higher levels have more oyer, less keli. The lower levels have more keli and less oyer. That's the way that's why existence comes to become existence. But the goal is to take a world of kalim with very little oyer on a reveal level, like a student, a beginner, only knows aleph beis, ABC, and to expand the containers to be able to draw more energy to the point where the oyer is more dominant than the keli. So in early education, you start with the kalim, with letters, with words, like writing. You learn to write A, B, C, D. You learn to write words, sentences, paragraphs, chapters, volumes. But then you come to realize these are the containers. Then the real goal is to convey the ideas that these letters and words and sentences and phrases and paragraphs and volumes, chapters and volumes ultimately communicate. So the same thing is with godliness. In the lowest levels, it's godliness as it relates to us in our containers. Then the containers expand and you can relate to godliness a little beyond our containers. And ultimately, you can start relating to the oyer as it is on its own, that's not connected to containers. The higher you go, the less tangible it is, but it doesn't mean it's less real. It's actually much more real, but it's less murgish. You feel it less. It's less discernible and expressible. So that pnimis halev compared to chetzenis halev, sometimes you'll see somebody very expressive, very emotional, they get excited and passionate and so on. Another person is sitting quietly. And you could say, okay, that person must be cold and detached and aloof. Later, you find out that that person experienced it even more than the person that's expressing it all. Except by them, it's because their mind is so powerful, they don't have to express it in fireworks. They're some of the deepest experiences. You can have complete emotional experience and nobody sees it. Not everything is about expression. The Rebbe, I remember it was Vav Tishrei Tavshim Amalef. And I was speaking about the different Rebbes. The Alter Rebbe was very passionate in the way he delivered Torah. He sometimes rolled on the floor. And when he davened, you could see the sweat, you could see the passion. The Mittler Rebbe, you couldn't see anything. He davened, he stood in one place, you didn't see any movement. But then the Rebbe said, this is one of the few times the Rebbe used his hands, he said, but the Rebbe's wore, they're called a streimel or a spadik. They wore a hat, and there were two types. One was with a spitz, like with a yarmulke, that like a point, and one was flat. The Mittler Rebbe wore more with a point, and when he would daven, this is what the Rebbe said. He took his hands like this, the Rebbe, and said, by the point was a little hole at the top, and you could see, and the Rebbe made with his hand. He did like this. You could see the para, the steam, the vapor come out from the top of the little hole on top of his head. The Rebbe did this, like that. In other words, internally, he was experiencing the same passion, or if not more even, like another person expresses it. And you could see it through the vapor that came out. That was the only place to see it. So which is deeper? So Chassidus Halev is louder, more expressive. Primus Halev is more internal and more intimate, but not necessarily less. On the contrary, it's more. So this is what he's saying now. We've reached our level where the midas become sichlim. Not that the midas are losing their emotional power. They're losing their subjective self-interest power. And they're being absorbed in the higher thing where the mind is radiating in the heart, and the emotions are now lifted up to this, we'll call it more silent, but deeper expression of the experience. Okay. So we're going to stop here at the end of this paragraph, but go ahead. Anybody has any questions? No? Okay. Because with this, he concludes the three levels of mutfa, murgish, and muskul that began on page 1224. But more specifically on 1225, how it is in the neshama lekis. So I'm going to stop here on page 1230. And we will learn I'm going to look, as I said, the Kuntus Aveda, we'll look at that, and the Maimorim that he refers to. And with that,